She was Seattle's most ruthless billionaire, a tech empire heiress who had just lost the use of her legs in a mysterious crash, bitter and paranoid. She fired 14 caregivers and assistants in a single week. Nobody survived her wrath. Then came David, a desperate single father staring down a mountain of medical debt for his 7-year-old daughter. He didn't care about her temper, her screaming, or her shattered glass. He refused to walk away. And that was the exact moment the trap closed on them both. The Harrington estate in Medina, Washington, was a fortress of glass, steel, and silence. It overlooked Lake Washington, an architectural marvel worth $45 million. But to 32-year-old Charlotte Harrington, it had become a customized prison. 6 months ago, Charlotte was the untouchable CEO of Harrington Enterprises, a global logistics and software conglomerate she inherited from her late father. She was known on the cover of Forbes as the Ice Queen of the Pacific Northwest. Then came the rainy Tuesday in November. Her armored Maybach inexplicably lost its brakes on a winding road in the Cascade Mountains, sending the vehicle plunging down a 40-foot embankment. Her driver died on impact. Charlotte survived, but her spine was crushed at the T8 vertebra. She was permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Since returning to her estate, the Ice Queen had melted into a storm of unadulterated rage. Standing in the grand foyer, holding a worn leather briefcase, was David Miller. At 35, David possessed the kind of quiet, weathered resilience that only comes from a lifetime of hard knocks. He used to be a senior structural analyst for a mid-sized firm in Portland, a man who built things. But when his 7-year-old daughter, Fiona, was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease, his life fractured. The treatments at Seattle Children's Hospital were bleeding him dry. He had lost his job, his savings, and his pride. What he needed now was the one thing Harrington Enterprises offered its executive personal assistants: the Platinum Tier, zero-deductible corporate health insurance policy. Beside David stood Sarah Jenkins, a visibly trembling HR executive. "David," Sarah whispered, clutching her tablet like a shield. "I need to be perfectly honest with you. You are the 15th person we've brought to this house in 9 days. The longest anyone has lasted is 14 hours. She threw a hot cup of Earl Grey tea at the last guy. If you want to back out, I will still pay you for the day." "I'm not backing out, Sarah," David said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He adjusted his collar. "Lead the way." They walked through the cavernous hallways. The house was aggressively modern, stripped of any warmth. Finally, they reached the sunken living room. The automatic blinds were drawn, casting the massive space in perpetual twilight. In the center of the room, sitting in a customized, matte black motorized wheelchair, was Charlotte Harrington. She was devastatingly striking, even in her disheveled state. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her sharp, aristocratic features were pale and drawn. She wore silk pajamas that looked like they hadn't been changed in 3 days. Surrounding her chair was a graveyard of shattered porcelain, scattered papers, and spilled coffee. I told security to lock the front gates." Charlotte's voice snapped through the darkness like a whip. She didn't even look up from the tablet resting on her lap. "Who let you in, Sarah, and what is breathing next to you?" "Ms. Harrington," Sarah squeaked. "This is David Miller. He's the new—" "Fired," Charlotte interrupted, swiping a finger viciously across her screen. "Ma'am, he has exceptional references, and given the board's mandate that you have 24-hour—" "I said he is fired!" Charlotte roared, suddenly spinning her chair around. Her eyes, a piercing, icy blue, locked onto David. They were feral, filled with a mixture of agony and humiliation. She grabbed a crystal paperweight from the side table and hurled it. It didn't hit David, but it smashed against the Venetian plaster wall 3 feet from his head, raining glass shards onto the hardwood floor. "Get out of my house, both of you! I don't need babysitters. I don't need vultures waiting for me to die." Sarah let out a muffled sob and practically ran back toward the hallway. "I'm sorry, David," she called out, fleeing the estate. The heavy oak doors slammed shut in the distance. The echo faded, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the living room. Charlotte sat breathing heavily, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles were white. She glared at David, waiting for him to run, waiting for the fear. David didn't move. He didn't flinch. Slowly, he set his battered leather briefcase on a pristine glass coffee table. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and walked calmly toward a utility closet he had spotted near the kitchen entrance. A minute later, he returned with a dustpan and a broom. Without a word, David knelt on the floor and began sweeping up the shattered crystal and porcelain. "Are you deaf?" Charlotte sneered, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I told you to get out. You are trespassing. My contract says I work for Harrington Enterprises, not you personally." "Ms. Harrington," David replied calmly, dumping a pile of glass into the dustpan. "And Human Resources hired me for a minimum probationary period of 30 days. Unless I breach contract, I stay, and I am not leaving. I will call the police and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs." "You could," David said, standing up and looking down at her. His brown eyes were completely devoid of pity, which caught her off guard. "But if you do, the police report will be filed. The board of directors, specifically Gregory Langdon, will get a copy of that report. They will use your emotional instability as proof that you are unfit to remain CEO, and they will vote you out by Friday. You know that. I know that. So, let's skip the part where you throw things at me, and tell me how you want your coffee." Charlotte stared at him. The sheer audacity of his response left her momentarily speechless. No one spoke to her like that. Not before the accident, and certainly not after. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, Mr. Miller," she whispered venomously. "I'm dealing with a boss who needs a clean floor and a clear schedule," David said, walking the glass to the trash bin. "Black, or with cream?" Charlotte's eyes narrowed into slits. She wasn't going to fire him. She was going to break him. The first 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Charlotte Harrington didn't just want David to quit. She wanted him to flee, crying. She treated him less like an assistant and more like a pack mule. On Tuesday night at 2:14 a.m., she rang the buzzer in his downstairs guest suite. When David arrived in her office, groggy and hastily dressed, she demanded he recatalog 10 years of physical blueprints for her overseas shipping yards. "The digital files are corrupted," she lied smoothly, staring at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I need the hard copies cross-referenced by serial number. Now." David spent 6 hours on his hands and knees in the dusty archives of her basement, sorting thousands of pages. By 8 a.m., he brought her the organized binders, along with a perfectly brewed espresso. He didn't complain. He didn't sigh. On Wednesday afternoon, she intentionally knocked a bowl of hot soup onto the rug. "My spasm," she claimed coldly. "Clean it." He scrubbed the rug until his fingers were raw. She denied him a lunch break, sending him on absurd errands across Seattle in rush-hour traffic, fetching a specific brand of imported fountain pen ink from a boutique in Ballard, only to tell him it was the wrong shade of blue when he returned. Through it all, David remained a ghost of compliance. He absorbed her venom with a shield of absolute professionalism. But underneath, the strain was cracking him. On Thursday evening, the house was finally quiet. Charlotte had retreated to her master suite, refusing dinner. David sat in the dimly lit kitchen, a cold cup of coffee in his hands, staring at his glowing phone screen. It was a FaceTime call with Fiona. His daughter looked small in the stark white hospital bed at Seattle Children's. The tubes running across her pale arms made David's chest tighten with a physical ache. "Hi, Daddy." Fiona smiled, her voice raspy. "Hey, Bug." David smiled back, forcing the exhaustion out of his eyes. "How are the nurses treating you today? Did you show them the drawing?" "I did. Nurse Mary said my dragon looked like a dog. Though," Fiona giggled, before a small cough racked her tiny frame. "When are you coming to visit?" "Saturday morning, bright and early," David promised, his throat tightening. "I've got a new job, Bug. It's demanding, but it's going to pay for everything. I promise. You just keep being brave for me, okay?" "I'm brave, Daddy, like a dragon." When the call ended, David dropped his head into his hands, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The medical bill notification that had popped up during the call sat at the top of his screen. Balance. Due. $142,500 if he survived 30 days here. The corporate insurance would retroactively cover it. He had to survive. He didn't realize someone was watching him. Charlotte had silently rolled her wheelchair into the shadowed hallway just outside the kitchen to demand he fetch her a file. She had stopped when she heard him talking. She saw the crushed, desperate look on his face when the call ended. For the first time since she had met him, she saw a vulnerability that rivaled her own. He wasn't a corporate spy or a greedy opportunist. He was a drowning man. The next morning, the dynamic in the house shifted, though neither acknowledged it aloud. Charlotte rolled into the dining room at 9 a.m. David had already set out her breakfast, her medication, and her tablet, synced to the morning's financial reports. "Cancel my afternoon physical therapy," she ordered, her tone slightly less sharp than the day before. "The board is holding an emergency proxy vote at 2 p.m. Gregory Langdon is trying to push through the acquisition of Horizon Logistics while I'm incapacitated. He thinks I can't read the finer details of the merger while on painkillers." "Are you going to stop him?" David asked, clearing away her plate. "I'm trying to," Charlotte scowled, tapping her tablet violently. But Langdon buried the structural asset reports in thousands of pages of legal jargon. "I have my lawyers combing through it, but they're moving too slow. Langdon knows exactly what he's doing. He's claiming Horizon's infrastructure in Tokyo is state-of-the-art, justifying the $3 billion price tag. If I can't prove he's lying, the board will override my veto." David paused. He looked at the stacks of printed reports on the dining table. "May I?" he asked, pointing to a thick binder labeled Horizon Logistics, Tokyo Sector Architectural Addendum. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Unless you have a sudden, secret law degree, Mr. Miller, I doubt you'll be of much use." "No law degree," David said, pulling the binder toward him. "But before my daughter got sick, I was the lead structural analyst for Kincaid Engineering. I spent 7 years evaluating deepwater logistics hubs." Charlotte stared at him, stunned. "You're an engineer?" "I was," David murmured, his eyes scanning the dense blueprints and material manifests on the pages. He flipped through the document with rapid, practiced precision. 10 minutes passed in silence. Charlotte watched him, her heart beating a strange, uneven rhythm. Suddenly, David tapped a finger hard against a page. "Here." "What is it?" she asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Langdon's report claims the Tokyo docks use grade A marine steel for their retaining walls, which justifies the valuation. But look at this material invoice hidden in the appendix. They didn't use marine steel. They used standard carbon steel, coated in anti-corrosive paint. It's a cheap retrofit. Charlotte's eyes widened as she read the lines he pointed out. In a saltwater environment, David continued, his voice dead serious. That carbon steel will suffer catastrophic galvanic corrosion within 5 years. The entire dock system will literally crumble into the ocean. Horizon isn't a $3 billion asset. It's a multi-million-dollar liability. Langdon isn't just making a bad deal. He's inflating the company's worth. A slow, vicious smile spread across Charlotte's face. The first real smile David had seen. It was terrifying and beautiful. He's getting a kickback, Charlotte whispered. Langdon is inflating the price, and Horizon's owners are paying him off under the table. She looked up at David, the ice in her eyes replaced by a burning fire. Mr. Miller, get my lawyers on a conference call. Immediately. The 2 p.m. board meeting was held via secure video conference. Charlotte sat at the head of her massive mahogany dining table, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask. David stood silently in the corner of the room, just out of the camera's view, holding a tablet synced to the presentation. On the screen, a mosaic of 12 older, wealthy men and women looked back at her. In the center square was Gregory Langdon. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair, a custom Italian suit, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had been her father's right-hand man, and he had made no secret of his belief that Charlotte was too young and now too broken to run the empire. Charlotte, darling, it's so good to see you sitting up, Langdon said, his voice dripping with condescension. We were worried you might not be strong enough to join us today. We can handle the Horizon acquisition without stressing you. I am perfectly capable, Gregory, Charlotte said coldly. And I am formally vetoing the acquisition. A murmur rippled through the board members. Charlotte, be reasonable. Langdon sighed, rubbing his temples for the camera. We have gone over this. Horizon is a gold mine. The Tokyo infrastructure alone is worth the price. We have the independent asset evaluations right here. You mean the evaluations you commissioned? Charlotte countered. The ones that buried the structural material invoices in Appendix G. Langdon's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, Gregory, that you are attempting to buy a logistics hub built on standard carbon steel, not marine grade, a hub that will collapse into the Pacific in 5 years. Charlotte nodded slightly. From the corner, David hit a button on his tablet. Instantly, the screens of every board member flashed with the highlighted invoices David had found, accompanied by a rapid corrosion analysis he had drafted during his lunch hour. The video feed erupted into chaos. Board members began shouting over one another. What is this? Langdon! Demanded Eleanor Vance, one of the senior shareholders. This is fabricated! Langdon snapped, his face reddening. Charlotte, you are heavily medicated. You don't understand these engineering specs. Who fed you this garbage? My independent analyst. Charlotte lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with the camera. And unless you want me to launch a formal forensic audit into your personal offshore accounts to see exactly how much Horizon is paying you to push this through, I suggest you withdraw the motion. Immediately. Langdon stared at her through the screen. The mask of the caring uncle was completely gone, replaced by pure, venomous hatred. You're playing a dangerous game, Charlotte. You aren't untouchable anymore. You can't even walk to the door. I don't need to walk. Gregory, I just need to sign your termination papers. Motion to acquire Horizon is denied. Meeting adjourned. Charlotte cut the feed. The screen went black. The silence in the dining room was deafening. Charlotte let out a long, shaky breath and slumped back into her wheelchair, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush. She closed her eyes. That, David said quietly from the corner, was intense. Charlotte opened her eyes and looked at him. He's going to retaliate. Langdon doesn't lose. He's going to dig into everything I do, trying to find a weakness to exploit so he can trigger a medical unfitness clause and seize the company. Then we make sure he doesn't find one, David said, stepping forward. You need to lock down this house. Digital security, physical security. If he's dirty enough to take kickbacks on a $3 billion deal, he's dirty enough to play rough. Charlotte studied David carefully. For the first time, she truly saw him. He wasn't just a desperate father. He was a brilliantly capable man who had just saved her company from a fatal blow. Why did you do it? She asked softly. You could have let me fail. You could have walked away. You hate me. I've treated you like dirt since the moment you arrived. David set the tablet down on the table. He leaned against the heavy wood, meeting her gaze levelly. I don't hate you, Charlotte. I think you're terrified. I think you push people away because if they leave because you're cruel, it hurts less than if they leave because you're broken. Charlotte flinched. The words hit her harder than the car crash. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw, unfiltered honesty. But I have my own reasons for staying, David continued, his voice softening. My daughter, Fiona, she's at Seattle Children's. She needs specialized immunotherapy that costs more than I could ever make in a lifetime. Your insurance covers it. If I lose this job, I lose her. So I am going to keep your schedule. I am going to sweep up your broken glass. And I am going to help you crush anyone who tries to take your company. Because if you go down, I go down. And I refuse to lose. Charlotte stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. A strange alliance was forging in the cold, cavernous room, a pact built, not on trust, but on mutual, desperate survival. Langdon is going to come after me, she whispered. Let him, David said. That night, the Cold War between Charlotte and David ended. They spent the next 3 days barricaded in her office, operating as a singular unit. David stopped being just an assistant. He became her proxy, her legs, and her most trusted advisor. He managed the estate staff remotely, overhauled her physical therapy schedule to be more aggressive, and began auditing the last 3 years of Langdon's executive decisions. But Langdon was already moving in the shadows. On Monday night at 11:45 p.m., David was in his guest suite, packing a small bag for his visit to the hospital the next morning. His phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered it. Hello, Mr. Miller. A smooth, chilling voice came through the speaker. It was Gregory Langdon. I'm so glad I caught you. I've been doing some reading. Did you know the corporate health insurance policy for Harrington Enterprises only activates after a 30-day probationary period? It would be a terrible shame if you were terminated on day 29. Little Fiona might not get her treatments. David's blood ran cold. How do you know about my daughter? I know everything, David. I know you're the one feeding Charlotte her lines. I know you're playing engineer. But you are out of your depth. Meet me at Pier 54 tomorrow at 6 a.m. We are going to have a conversation about your future employment. If you tell Charlotte, I will personally ensure the board voids her insurance mandates and Fiona gets discharged by noon. The line went dead. David stood in the dark room, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. The true war hadn't even begun. The morning fog rolling off Puget Sound was thick and biting, wrapping Seattle's Pier 54 in a damp, gray shroud. At 5:50 a.m., the wooden planks of the pier were mostly deserted, save for a few local fishermen and seagulls fighting over scraps. David Miller stood near the edge, his collar turned up against the wind. His hands were shoved deep into his trench coat pockets. The exhaustion in his bones was profound, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him hyper-alert. He was a father fighting for his daughter's life. There was no room for fatigue. At precisely 6 a.m., a black Mercedes S-Class glided silently to a halt near the loading zones. The rear door opened, and Gregory Langdon stepped out. Even in the freezing mist, the man looked impeccably tailored, holding an umbrella he didn't strictly need. He walked toward David with the leisurely, confident stride of a man who owned the world. "Mr. Miller," Langdon said smoothly, coming to a stop a few feet away. "Thank you for being punctual. I appreciate a man who understands the gravity of his situation." "Cut the theatrics, Langdon," David said, his voice flat and hard. "What do you want?" Langdon chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Straight to the point. Admirable. I'll make this incredibly simple. Charlotte Harrington is a broken woman holding on to an empire she can no longer steer. Her little stunt yesterday cost me a significant amount of capital, and it embarrassed the board. She is a liability. But you, David, you are just a casualty of her collateral damage." Langdon reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, silver object, a custom-encrypted USB flash drive. He held it out between his index and middle fingers. "Tonight, at exactly 2 a.m., Charlotte's secure terminal will run an automated backup to the Harrington Enterprises mainframe," Langdon explained. "All you need to do is plug this drive into the port on her desk. It contains a self-executing script. It won't crash the system. It will simply initiate a series of erratic, highly leveraged, nonsensical stock trades under her personal credentials. By tomorrow morning, the board's automated risk management software will flag her account for catastrophic cognitive impairment. We will invoke Section 4 of the corporate bylaws, declaring her medically unfit to govern." David stared at the silver drive. "You're asking me to frame her." "I'm asking you to secure your daughter's future," Langdon corrected, his eyes narrowing. "If you do this, I will personally establish a $2 million trust for Fiona at Seattle Metro Bank by noon tomorrow. Plus, I will override the probationary period on your insurance, giving you platinum coverage for life. If you refuse, or if you tell Charlotte, I will have you fired by 9:01 a.m. Your insurance will be voided, and Seattle Children's will be forced to discharge Fiona when your billing defaults next week." The wind howled across the pier. David looked at the water, thinking of Fiona's pale face, the tubes, the monitors. Then he looked at Langdon, a man willing to destroy a sick child to make a few $1 billion. David reached out and took the USB drive, slipping it into his pocket. "Smart man," Langdon smiled, turning back toward his Mercedes. "I look forward to our mutually beneficial relationship, Mr. Miller." 30 minutes later, David's car pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Medina estate. The house was quiet. He walked directly past his guest suite, bypassed the kitchen, and marched straight into the master wing. Charlotte was already awake in her customized chair, positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain on Lake Washington. She looked over her shoulder, startled by his abrupt entrance. "David, it's barely 7. What are you—" David walked over to her glass desk, reached into his coat, and slammed the silver USB drive onto the surface. The sharp clack echoed in the silent room. Charlotte frowned, rolling her chair toward the desk. "What is that?" It's a Trojan horse," David said, his voice raw. "Langdon met me at Pier 54 an hour ago. He threatened to have my daughter's medical coverage terminated unless I plug that into your terminal tonight to execute erratic trades. He wants to trigger a cognitive impairment review and force you out under a Section 4 bylaw." Charlotte stared at the drive, then slowly looked up at David. Her chest tightened. She had spent her entire life surrounded by sycophants and backstabbers. Everyone had a price. Everyone. "Why are you showing this to me?" Charlotte whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "He offered you your daughter's life. David, why didn't you just plug it in?" "Because my daughter is sick. But she has a father who doesn't negotiate with terrorists," David said fiercely. "And because you are the only one who can actually destroy him. If I help him take you down, he'll own the company, and I'll be at his mercy forever. I don't trust him. I trust you." The absolute conviction in his eyes struck Charlotte like a physical blow. A sudden, unfamiliar warmth blossomed in her chest. She wasn't alone. For the first time since her spine was shattered on that mountain road. She truly wasn't alone. A dangerous, razor-sharp smile slowly spread across Charlotte's face. "He wants to play with corporate espionage. Fine. Call Leo Rossi. He's the former head of cybersecurity for the Department of Defense, and he owes me a favor. We aren't going to destroy this drive, David. We are going to reverse engineer it. When Langdon tries to execute those trades, they aren't going to hit my accounts. They are going to trace directly back to his offshore shell companies." The counterattack was set in motion. But Gregory Langdon was not a man who relied on a single bullet. As the USB trap was being meticulously rewired by Leo Rossi in the estate's basement, Langdon struck from a different angle. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The heavy oak doors of the estate chimed, and before David could reach the foyer, 3 people had let themselves in, using executive override codes. Leading the pack was Dr. Richard Gable, the chief medical officer for Harrington Enterprises. Flanking him were 2 massive private security contractors. Dr. Gable was a tall, skeletal man with cold eyes and a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain lead. "Dr. Gable," David said, stepping into the hallway to block their path to Charlotte's study. "You don't have an appointment?" "I don't need one, Mr. Miller," Gable replied, holding up a legal document stamped with the Harrington Enterprises board seal. "Pursuant to the emergency health provisions invoked by Mr. Langdon this morning, I am here to conduct a mandatory competency and neurological evaluation on Ms. Harrington. Step aside." Charlotte wheeled herself out of the study, her face an unreadable mask of ice. "It's fine. David, let him in." The exam took place in the grand living room. It was not a medical checkup. It was an interrogation designed to break her. Gable spent 40 minutes peppering Charlotte with rapid-fire, highly complex financial and legal hypotheticals, trying to confuse her. He tested her reflexes with rough, borderline abusive force, repeatedly striking the deadened nerves in her legs and watching her face for signs of psychological distress. David stood tightly in the corner, his phone surreptitiously recording the entire encounter. His knuckles were white. He wanted to throw Gable through the glass window, but he knew if he interfered, Gable would immediately report Charlotte as hostile and uncooperative. "Your spasms have increased in severity, Charlotte," Dr. Gable noted, opening his briefcase. "And your resting heart rate is highly elevated. You are clearly suffering from post-traumatic stress and extreme anxiety, rendering you incapable of making rational corporate decisions. I am going to administer a heavy dose of lorazepam to calm your nervous system. I will then recommend to the board a mandatory 6-month medical leave." Gable pulled a pre-filled syringe from his bag. Charlotte's eyes widened in genuine panic. She knew what heavy sedatives did to her. They clouded her mind, made her slur her words. If Gable filmed her under the influence of that drug, she would look entirely incompetent. "I refuse that medication," Charlotte said, sharply, gripping her armrests. It's not a request. Charlotte, it is a board-mandated treatment for your current agitated state, Gable said, stepping toward her, the needle glinting in the dim light. The two security contractors stepped forward, physically blocking the exit. "She said no!" David's voice boomed through the room. He didn't just step forward. He moved with the sudden, violent velocity of a protective father. Before the security contractors could react, David grabbed Dr. Gable's wrist, twisting it sharply. The syringe clattered onto the hardwood floor. "Assault!" Gable shouted, clutching his wrist. "You are assaulting a medical professional!" I'm stopping a forced chemical restraint, which is a felony in the state of Washington," David snarled, kicking the syringe across the room. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen showing the active recording. "I have this entire session on video, the aggressive questioning, the rough physical handling, and the attempt to inject an unconsenting patient with a Schedule IV narcotic without a secondary physician present." The two security contractors hesitated, looking at the recording phone. "Get out of my house," Charlotte commanded, her voice vibrating with authority, having regained her composure. "And Dr. Gable, consider your employment at Harrington Enterprises officially terminated. My lawyers will be sending this video to the state medical board before you reach your car." Gable went pale. He snatched his briefcase and stormed out, the security detail trailing awkwardly behind him. When the door slammed shut, the silence in the room was heavy. Charlotte let out a sudden, ragged breath and slumped forward in her wheelchair. The invincible Ice Queen facade crumbled. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, dry sobs. The violation of her bodily autonomy, the constant attacks, it was breaking her. David didn't hesitate. He knelt on the floor beside her wheelchair, right in the middle of the grand, empty room. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just reached out and gently placed a strong, warm hand over hers. Charlotte flinched initially, unaccustomed to touch that wasn't clinical or violent. But then, slowly, she leaned down, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "They aren't going to stop. David," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Langdon won't stop until he completely destroys me." "Then we destroy him first," David said softly, his jaw set. "You are Charlotte Harrington. You built logistics networks across 3 continents before you were 30. You survived a 40-foot drop off a mountain. You are not going to let a middle management parasite take what is yours." Charlotte lifted her head, looking into David's eyes. They were inches apart. She saw the fierce loyalty there, a loyalty that had cost him his peace and risked his daughter's future. "Why do you believe in me so much?" she asked. "Because I know what it looks like when someone refuses to die," David said. "I see it in my daughter every day, and I see it in you." Charlotte took a deep breath, the ice returning to her veins. But this time, it was tempered with steel. "The annual shareholder gala is this Saturday at the Fairmont Olympic. Langdon is planning to use it to announce his interim CEO status. Assuming the USB trades or Gable's report took me down, we are going to that gala, David, and we are going to execute him in front of everyone." The Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle was a monument to old-world luxury. By 7:01 p.m. on Saturday, the grand ballroom was overflowing with the elite of the Pacific Northwest. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the gold-leafed ceilings, illuminating a sea of tuxedos, diamond necklaces, and whispered conspiracies. Gregory Langdon stood near the front podium, holding a glass of scotch, accepting premature congratulations from his loyalists on the board. He had received word that Dr. Gable had failed. But it didn't matter. The USB drive trap was set. In a few hours, the automated system would execute the ruinous trades, and Charlotte's fate would be sealed. Tonight, he would lay the groundwork, expressing his deepest sorrows for Charlotte's declining mental health to the shareholders. Back at the Medina estate, the atmosphere was a mixture of a war room and a dressing room. Charlotte sat before her vanity mirror. She wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored midnight blue gown that flowed elegantly over her legs, designed specifically so the fabric wouldn't bunch in her wheelchair. Her dark hair was swept up into an immaculate twist, and a simple, devastatingly expensive diamond necklace rested against her collarbone. She looked every inch the billionaire sovereign. David stood behind her, wearing a crisp, perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He was adjusting the silver clasp of her necklace. Their eyes met in the mirror. The air between them hummed with an unspoken, electric tension. "You look spectacular," David said quietly, his hands lingering near her shoulders for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "You clean up well yourself, Mr. Miller," Charlotte replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. "Are you ready for this?" Rossi confirmed the reverse code is active. David nodded. "When Langdon's script triggers, the data packets will reroute to his personal Cayman's accounts. We have the financial ledgers ready to project onto the ballroom screens. He won't know what hit him." Suddenly, David's phone began to vibrate violently in his tuxedo pocket. A custom ringtone pierced the quiet room. It was the emergency bypass line for Seattle Children's Hospital. David's blood ran cold. He pulled the phone out, his hands shaking slightly, and answered, "Miller." Charlotte watched him through the mirror. She saw the color instantly drain from his face. "What do you mean her fever spiked to 104? David's voice cracked. The confident right-hand man, instantly reverting to a terrified father. "Is she breathing on her own? I'm on my way. Do whatever you have to do. Dr. Evans, I'm leaving now." He hung up the phone. The silence in the room was suffocating. "It's Fiona," David choked out, tearing off his bow tie. "She's crashing. A sudden secondary infection. They are moving her to the pediatric ICU. I have to." He looked at Charlotte, torn. "The gala. The projection system. I have the master control on my tablet." Charlotte spun her wheelchair around. Her eyes were fierce, brooking absolutely no argument. "Give the tablet to my head of security. Then get in my armored Maybach. My driver is taking you to the hospital with a full security escort. You will not stop for red lights." "Charlotte, Langdon is going to eat you alive if you go in there alone," David protested, though he was already walking toward the door. "I built this empire. David, I can handle Gregory Langdon for an hour. Go to your daughter. Make me fire you." David stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, deeply moved by the absolute selflessness of the woman the world called an ice queen. "Thank you," he whispered, and sprinted down the hallway. An hour later, Charlotte's motorcade arrived at the Fairmont Olympic. The press was waiting. Flashes exploded like lightning as her security detail lowered the hydraulic ramp. Charlotte wheeled herself down, her chin held high, staring straight ahead. Inside the ballroom, a hush fell over the 1,000 assembled guests as the heavy oak doors opened. The music stopped. The whispers ceased. Charlotte Harrington rolled down the center aisle, parting the sea of billionaires and executives like royalty returning from exile. She ignored the stares. She ignored the pity. Her eyes were locked onto the podium at the front of the room, where Gregory Langdon's smug smile was rapidly faltering. Meanwhile, at Seattle Children's Hospital, David sprinted through the stark white corridors of the ICU, his tuxedo drawing strange looks from the nurses. He burst into Fiona's room. His daughter was surrounded by machines, but her eyes were open, and the frantic beeping of the monitors had steadied to a rhythmic pulse. Dr. Evans, the head of pediatric immunology, was adjusting an IV bag filled with a strange amber-colored fluid. "David," Dr. Evans said, looking up, relief evident on his face. "She's stabilizing. Her temperature is breaking." David practically collapsed into the chair beside the bed, grabbing Fiona's tiny hand and kissing it repeatedly. Tears streamed down his face. "What happened? You said she was crashing." "She was," Dr. Evans explained, looking at his chart. "Her body was rejecting the standard antibiotics. But an hour ago, a courier arrived with an experimental, localized biologic treatment synthesized at a private lab in Germany. It's highly restricted, incredibly expensive, and usually takes months to clear customs." David frowned, looking up. "How did it get here?" Dr. Evans smiled faintly. "Your employer, Ms. Harrington. She apparently bought the entire German research facility yesterday morning and used a private medical jet to fly the serum directly to Boeing Field. She authorized it outside of your corporate insurance, paid out of pocket, $10 million. David sat frozen. Charlotte hadn't just been fighting a corporate war. She had secretly moved mountains to save his child, knowing he would be too proud to ask. She had done it silently, while fighting for her own life. He looked at his watch. 8:45 p.m. Langdon's keynote address was scheduled for 9 p.m. Charlotte was facing the wolves alone. David leaned down and kissed Fiona's forehead. "Daddy loves you. Bug, you keep fighting. I'll be right back." "Where are you going?" Dr. Evans asked. David stood up, adjusting his tuxedo jacket, his eyes burning with a fierce, unstoppable resolve. "I have to go help a friend burn down a boardroom." The Fairmont Olympic Ballroom was a glittering battlefield of crystal and velvet, as Charlotte Harrington wheeled herself down the center aisle. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft electric hum of her customized matte black chair. She wore her spine like a steel rod, her chin elevated, her icy blue eyes locked onto the podium. At the front of the room, Gregory Langdon's grip tightened on the mahogany edges of the rostrum. The smug, patrician smile he had worn all evening congealed into a rictus of forced pleasantry. He leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing across the cavernous, gold-leafed ceiling. "Ah, Charlotte," Langdon purred, projecting his voice for the 1,000 shareholders in attendance. "What a bittersweet surprise. We were just discussing your courageous, if ultimately tragic, battle with your recent physical and mental traumas. We didn't expect you to leave the Medina estate." "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Enterprises, Gregory," Charlotte said, her voice carrying without the aid of a microphone. It was sharp, authoritative, and utterly devoid of fear. "I do not require an invitation to my own company's annual gala, and I certainly do not require your eulogy while I am still breathing." A low murmur rippled through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. The board members sitting at the front tables exchanged nervous, calculating glances. Langdon chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. "Of course, Charlotte, we all admire your tenacity, but this board has a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. This morning, you exhibited deeply concerning, erratic behavior. Our chief medical officer attempted to evaluate you, and your personal assistant physically assaulted him. You are surrounded by sycophants enabling a dangerous psychological decline." Charlotte stopped her chair at the base of the stage. "Doctor, Gable is a mercenary who attempted to chemically restrain me without consent. He is currently under investigation, by the Washington State Medical Board. Langdon raised a hand, playing the benevolent uncle. Charlotte, please, don't do this to yourself in public. The board has already reviewed the automated risk management alerts. It seems your cognitive decline is already affecting your financial judgment. In fact, our system flagged catastrophic, highly leveraged trades originating from your personal terminal just an hour ago. You are bankrupting this company as we speak. He gestured to the massive digital projection screens flanking the stage. Langdon had ordered his IT director to manually trigger the Trojan horse early, bypassing the 2 a.m. failsafe to create a live, public spectacle of her insanity. Show them, Langdon commanded into his earpiece. On the other side of the Fairmont Hotel, in the third-floor audio-visual control room, Langdon's IT director was sweating profusely. He was frantically mashing the keyboard. Suddenly, the control room door burst open. The heavy steel door cracked against the wall with the force of a gunshot. David Miller stood in the doorway, his tuxedo jacket gone, his breathing heavy, his eyes burning with the lethal intensity of a father who had just walked through fire. Behind him stood 2 massive agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division, whom Leo Rossi had positioned in the lobby hours ago. "Step away from the console," David commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The IT director froze, raising his hands and backing away. David stepped up to the master terminal. He pulled a black tablet from his briefcase, plugged a direct tether into the mainframe, and executed the master override code Rossi had provided. Down in the ballroom, Langdon smiled triumphantly at the crowd as the massive screens flickered to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the tragic reality of Charlotte Harrington's mental state. Look at the capital she is hemorrhaging." The screens illuminated, but they did not show Charlotte's accounts. Instead, a massive, undeniably clear schematic of offshore banking ledgers appeared. The header read, Cayman Islands, Account Alpha 7, Beneficiary, Gregory Langdon. The ballroom erupted into gasps. "What is this?" Langdon sputtered, tapping his earpiece frantically. "Cut the feed! Cut the feed!" The screens shifted. Now, they displayed the raw, unredacted material invoices from Horizon Logistics, the very documents David had uncovered, side by side with wire transfer receipts. 3 separate payments of $25 million, routed from Horizon's parent company directly into Langdon's shell accounts. "The trades you attempted to trigger through my terminal tonight, Gregory, were rerouted," Charlotte said. Her voice finally amplified as a brave AV technician handed her a wireless microphone. "My cybersecurity team reverse-engineered the Trojan drive you tried to blackmail my assistant into using. Those screens are currently broadcasting real-time data packets, linking your offshore accounts to corporate espionage, extortion, and systemic fraud." Langdon's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was just waiting to hit the ground. "This is a fabrication. She's hacking the system. Security, remove her!" No one moved. The security detail lining the walls stood perfectly still. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened again. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as David Miller walked down the center aisle. He was flanked by the 2 FBI agents in dark suits. David's eyes never left Langdon. "Gregory Langdon," the lead federal agent announced, stepping onto the stage and pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for corporate fraud, extortion, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You have the right to remain silent." The flashbulbs of the press exploded in a blinding frenzy. Langdon was paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the agent violently secured his wrists behind his back. As they marched him down the stairs, Langdon locked eyes with Charlotte. You're a cripple, Langdon spat, his polished veneer completely destroyed, revealing the ugly, desperate animal beneath. You can't hold this empire together. You're nothing. Charlotte stared at him, her expression colder than liquid nitrogen. I may not be able to walk, Gregory, but I can still watch you crawl. Get him out of my sight. As Langdon was dragged out of the ballroom in handcuffs, the room descended into utter chaos. Shareholders were shouting. Board members were frantically pulling out their phones to call their lawyers. But in the center of the storm, Charlotte turned her wheelchair around. David was standing 10 feet away. He was breathless, his bow tie hanging loose around his collar, his shirt slightly rumpled. He looked exhausted, battered, and entirely magnificent. They locked eyes through the sea of panicking billionaires. The Cold War was over. The empire was secure. But as Charlotte looked at David, she knew the real battle, the battle for her own hollowed-out heart, had just begun. The aftermath of the Fairmont Olympic Gala was a blur of police statements, emergency board meetings, and absolute media frenzy. By 3 a.m., the hotel was empty, save for the cleaning staff vacuuming up the shattered remnants of Langdon's career. Charlotte was sitting in the dimly lit lobby lounge, staring out the massive bay windows at the Seattle rain. A glass of untouched bourbon sat on the table beside her. She was physically depleted, every muscle in her upper body aching from the sheer tension of the evening. Footsteps approached. David walked into the lounge, holding 2 cups of black coffee in cardboard sleeves. He set one down next to her bourbon and collapsed into the plush armchair across from her wheelchair. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of the Medina estate. It was the fragile, exhausted peace of 2 soldiers who had survived a siege. Rossi secured the servers, David finally said, his voice raspy. Langdon is sitting in a federal holding cell. The board held an emergency proxy vote 20 minutes ago. They unanimously reaffirmed you as CEO, with full executive powers. You won. We won, Charlotte corrected softly. She wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, looking at him. How is Fiona? At the mention of his daughter's name, the iron walls David had built around himself all night finally collapsed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and dropped his face into his hands. His broad shoulders shook. It wasn't a violent sob, but a deep, shuddering release of absolute terror and overwhelming relief. Charlotte's heart clenched. Without thinking, she unlocked the wheels of her chair and rolled closer to him. She reached out, her pale hand resting gently on his shoulder. David took a ragged breath and lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed. She's stable. The fever broke an hour ago. The localized biologic. It worked. It's rewriting her immune response as we speak. Dr. Evans says she's going to make a full recovery. Thank God, Charlotte whispered. David looked at her, his dark eyes piercing right through her carefully constructed armor. Dr. Evans also told me where the biologic came from. He told me about the lab in Germany. $10 million. Charlotte, you bought an entire pharmaceutical research facility and rerouted a private jet to save my daughter. You did it while Langdon was trying to destroy you. You did it in secret. Charlotte looked away, suddenly intensely uncomfortable. She was used to being feared, respected, or hated. She didn't know how to handle absolute, unconditional gratitude. It was a sound investment, she deflected, her voice tight. The lab holds several promising patents. It will diversify Harrington Enterprises' portfolio. Stop, David said softly. He reached out and gently covered her hand with his. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a jolt of electricity straight to her chest. Stop hiding behind the ice, for once in your life. Let someone see you." Charlotte closed her eyes. The walls she had built since the car crash, the impenetrable glass fortress she used to keep the world away so it couldn't hurt her, began to splinter. "I couldn't let her die. David," Charlotte whispered, a single tear escaping her closed eyes and tracing a path down her cheek. "I watched you walk into this nightmare of a house. I tortured you. I treated you like garbage. And you just kept sweeping up the glass. You were fighting so hard for her. I've spent my entire life surrounded by billions of dollars. And I have never loved anything as fiercely as you love that little girl." She opened her eyes, looking at him with a raw, heartbreaking vulnerability. "If Langdon had won today, I would have just lost a company. If you had lost Fiona, you would have lost your soul. I couldn't let that happen. Not to you." David moved from the armchair. He knelt on the carpeted floor directly in front of her wheelchair, just as he had done on the day of the medical ambush. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her shoulder. Charlotte gasped softly. For a moment, she was rigid, terrified of the contact. But then, slowly, she let go. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his hair, and wept. She cried for the legs she had lost, for the father who had left her to wolves, and for the terrifying, beautiful realization that she was no longer fighting alone. An hour later, as dawn began to break over the Seattle skyline, Charlotte's armored Maybach pulled up to the emergency entrance of Seattle Children's Hospital. David walked beside her wheelchair as they navigated the quiet, sterile corridors of the pediatric ICU. When they reached Fiona's room, David pushed the door open gently. Fiona was awake, sitting up slightly against the pillows. The terrifying monitors had been removed. She looked pale, but the agonizing flush of the fever was gone, replaced by a weary, resilient spark in her eyes. "Daddy," she croaked, holding out her arms. David practically tackled the bed, wrapping his daughter in a fierce, desperate hug. "Hey, Bug, I'm here. I'm right here." After a long moment, Fiona peeked over her father's shoulder. She looked at Charlotte, sitting quietly in her matte black wheelchair near the door. Fiona's large, curious eyes took in the expensive gown, the diamond necklace, and the imposing chair. "Are you the boss?" Fiona asked, her voice small but entirely unafraid. Charlotte felt a lump form in her throat. She wheeled herself closer to the bed, offering a soft, genuine smile that the corporate world had never seen. "I am. My name is Charlotte. My dad says you're very grumpy," Fiona observed innocently. David choked on a laugh, burying his face in the blankets. "Fiona, we talked about inside thoughts." Charlotte actually laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the sterile hospital room. "Your dad is absolutely right, Fiona. I can be very grumpy, but he is very brave. He helped me fight off some very bad people tonight." Fiona studied Charlotte for a moment, her eyes dropping to the wheelchair, and then back up to Charlotte's face. "You're in a chair like Jimmy down the hall. He says his legs are sleeping. Are yours sleeping too?" "Yes," Charlotte said softly, the sting of the truth softened by the child's absolute innocence. "They are sleeping, and they won't wake up, but that's okay, because I have a very fast chair." Fiona reached out a tiny, IV-bruised hand. Charlotte hesitated, then reached out and took it. "I think you're brave too," Fiona said seriously. "Like a dragon. Dragons don't need to walk. They just fly." Charlotte's breath caught. She looked at David, who was watching her with an expression of such profound love and admiration that it physically ached. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the hum of machines, the Ice Queen finally thawed completely. 6 months later, the Harrington estate in Medina was unrecognizable. The heavy, automated blackout blinds that had kept the house in perpetual twilight were gone. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the shimmering waters of Lake Washington. The graveyard of shattered porcelain and spilled coffee was a distant memory. The house smelled of fresh espresso, blooming hydrangeas, and life. Out on the expansive teak deck, an 8-year-old girl with a mop of curly brown hair was running full tilt after a golden retriever puppy. "Fiona, do not let that dog eat the azaleas!" David shouted from the open kitchen window, laughing as the dog aggressively tackled a bush. "He's not eating them! He's just tasting them!" Fiona yelled back, completely devoid of the sickly pallor that had haunted her for a year. The experimental biologic had been a miracle. She was in total remission, her immune system resetting itself with aggressive, vibrant energy. Inside the house, Charlotte sat at her glass desk in the master study. But she wasn't hiding. The doors were wide open. She wore a tailored, cream-colored silk blouse, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She was reviewing the quarterly earnings report for Harrington Enterprises. The company had undergone a massive restructuring. With Langdon in federal prison and his cronies purged from the board, Charlotte had taken absolute control. She had aggressively pivoted the company's logistics infrastructure toward green technology and medical supply chain optimization. The stock was up 40%. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. David walked into the study, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He wasn't wearing an ill-fitting suit or a subservient posture. He wore a crisp, dark navy button-down, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exuding quiet authority. 3 months ago, Charlotte had formally dissolved his contract as her personal assistant. The next day, the board had confirmed him as the new chief operating officer of Harrington Enterprises. He was no longer sweeping floors. He was running the global supply chain, using his engineering brilliance to rebuild the Tokyo hub properly. "Quarterly numbers look good," David said, setting a mug down next to her tablet. He leaned against the edge of her desk, crossing his arms. "They are staggering," Charlotte corrected, looking up at him. "Your redesign of the Seattle port logistics shaved 12% off our overhead. The board is terrified of you." "They should be," David smirked. "I learned from the most ruthless CEO in the Pacific Northwest." Charlotte smiled, a warm, radiant expression that reached her eyes. She pushed her wheelchair back from the desk and rolled over to him. David uncrossed his arms, stepping into her space. He reached down, his large hands resting gently on the armrests of her chair, boxing her in playfully. "Dr. Evans called this morning," David said, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. "Fiona's blood work is perfect. He said we only need to come in for checkups every 6 months now." That is the best news I've heard all year," Charlotte said, reaching up to rest her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The dynamic between them had shifted from desperate alliance to undeniable partnership, and finally, into a deep, consuming romance. They had fought a war together and survived. There were still hard days, days when the phantom pain in Charlotte's legs left her frustrated and angry, days when the trauma of the crash shadowed her mind. But David never flinched. He never walked away. He was her anchor, and she was his fierce, unbreakable protector. "I was thinking," David murmured, leaning down so his forehead rested against hers. Fiona's birthday is next month. She wants to go to Hawaii. She wants to see a real volcano. I think the CEO can approve a week of vacation for the COO. Charlotte breathed, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips brushed gently against hers. I love you, Charlotte, David whispered against her mouth. It was a statement of absolute, immovable fact, not because of her money or her power, but because of the woman she was, the dragon who had burned the world down to protect his child. I love you too, David, she replied, pulling him down into a deep, lingering kiss. Outside, the sun reflected off the glass walls of the fortress. It was no longer a prison for a paralyzed heiress. It was a home. The Ice Queen was dead, and in her place sat a woman who had learned that true power wasn't about standing on top of the world alone. It was about finding the people worth fighting for, and never, ever letting them go. The story of Charlotte and David reminds us that the greatest strength isn't always physical, and true loyalty isn't bought. It's forged in the fires of adversity. Sometimes, the walls we build to keep the world out only serve to lock us in, until someone brave enough refuses to walk away. If you were captivated by this intense drama of corporate warfare, unconditional love, and redemption, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video. Share it with your friends who love a thrilling real-life twist, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, heart-stopping stories every week. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all for the USB drive? Let us know.